Well, welcome back to ENGI 307, Data Analysis and Machine Learning. And so with this lecture, we're going to discuss the last type of machine learning approach that we have in this course, and this is going to be focusing on data clustering. And so what we have here, this will be a nice narrative discussion that will give a purview of these different types of possible ways of doing clustering. So for this module, so we'll be exploring data clustering problems. And so that would be the first thing, is trying to get a sense of, well, when would this have the most utility? And we'll be thinking about grouping data objects into groups based on similarities and dissimilarities. And in terms of the contents, we'll give an introduction to the data clustering problem. We'll then look at representing data clusters and then give some basic clustering methods, which will be the bulk of what we'll have. So in data sets for clustering problems, the outputs are not specified. The feature vectors are known, and the goal is to group data sets into multiple groups or clusters based on the similarities and dissimilarities. And then the extended goal is to study the groups and clusters for further analysis. So the applications can be in data exploration to understand the structure of complex data in order to identify patterns, and to map data in such a way that the supervised learning is easier. So clustering can be used for data exploration in order to understand the structure of the data. So that can be one of the things that will be important. This chapter focuses on unsupervised clustering using unlabeled samples without knowledge that categorizes without knowing the categories and function values. An example is image compression that uses clustering by quantizing aspects of the image like shade, reducing the number of information bits per pixel. For document clustering, it aims to classify similar documents. So for an example is for an outlier detection, one can find data points where they do not lie in any of the main clusters and are exceptions. Another example would be in document clustering. The aim is to find groups of similar documents. For example, news reports can be subdivided into those referring to politics, sports, etc. So we can use the knowledge of the problem described by the data set to help us in partitioning. There are two important features in partitioning: homogeneity in clusters. So the data within a given cluster should be similar to each other as possible. And heterogeneity between the clusters. Data belonging to different clusters should be as different from each other as possible. So features are mostly in numeric form. Thus, similarities can be assessed by distance measures like the Euclidean norm. So here is an illustration from Tsukiyama that helps get this nice visual in a two-dimensional space. So we're seeing clusters. The characteristics are very well behaved here. And here is an example of outliers that don't fall into a cluster. The rest of them are inliers, as we're seeing with that type of a figure. When clusters are formed, the results could be expressed as the form of a diagram that shows how the instances fall into groups. And we either can have exclusive or overlapping clusters. And so for exclusive, they're all different. And so we know that for sure. And for overlapping clusters, based on having a number of features, there could be examples of things that don't fall into this as clear type of clustering as we might like to have. We can also have probabilistic and hierarchical type of clusters. For probabilistic, we can have this kind of a relationship where we can see that these are clearly 3 points. This one to the right is even more distinct than the two that are on the left. Or we could have a hierarchical cluster that would be reminiscent, having us thinking similar to what we did with trees, decision trees. Well, what are the basic clustering methods that we can be leveraging? Well, there's a variety of them, and so we'll just go through a couple here. First, we'll talk about the k-mean algorithm. This is the most commonly used clustering algorithm. It uses exclusive cluster separation. All clusters contain all data vectors. Each object belongs to exactly one group. The clusters are disjoint, and none of them is empty nor contains the whole data set X. The goal is to find k points that make cluster centers. Each object is assigned to the cluster nearest to it. So we seek the best assignment of the cluster centers, minimize the sum of distance from every point to its nearest neighbor cluster. And for this type of approach, the drawback is it does not attempt to find the optimal solution. The process is that the k points are chosen at random as centers as cluster seeds. We assign points to the closest cluster centers via distance metric, calculate the centroid or mean of the objects in each cluster. Then we use the calculated centroids as a new cluster of centers for clusters. We repeat until the same points are assigned to each cluster in consecutive rounds. Okay, I'll just finish there with this first element of this, and we'll come back to this in just a minute.